So I really don't know too much about this situation, but this was in Durham in the 1960s?
Oh no, this would have been, Dot came to UNC after I was a student, so maybe in the 80s, huh?
Oh. Didn't Durham integrate before then?
Integration, but not integration of the schools, but what the issue was in the 80s was the merger of the city schools and the county schools.
Ah, yes.
And the city schools were 95% black, not counting our kids. And our kids were the 5%, and the county schools were mostly white, not entirely. And that was a pattern of kind of de facto segregation that characterized a lot of counties in the state of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And
I remember now.
there was a movement to merge the school systems, which caused a lot of turmoil in our community. And there was a whole task force that was put together by Bill Bell, who at that time was the chair of the county commissioners. There's a major story here that I only have peripheral knowledge of. My friend Kurt was a member. Was a member of that task force. But in the throes of that, it's interesting. I haven't thought about this in a while. So our kids went to public school.
City schools.
City schools. The city school system, and had a pretty good experience through elementary. Junior high was a little rocky. But then when they got to high school, it was more difficult. It was, Durham High School at that time was almost entirely poor and black. And, all the way through, we had been advocates for education, for public education, for, funding of public education, for evaluation of teachers. But when we got to the point where our kids were in middle school and high school, that kind of advocacy easily got interpreted as white elitism, which just killed me, because if we were white elites, we wouldn't have our kids in the city schools. I mean, many of our friends had bailed long before, and we were in the trenches trying to make this work because we were committed to public education. But we got tarred as kind of the white parents trying to make things good for their kids. And that showed up in an editorial in the newspaper, and that I realized that I needed to do something different. So I needed to change tactics, not just harassing the school board to do a better job, or the school administration. So I can't actually remember how Dot and I got started in this conversation.
This is Dorothy Brown.
Yes. And she was on the faculty at UNC in the Department of Maternal and Child Health. And I'm sure we met there. Whether that was the reason why we started this conversation or whether it's something else, I'd be really interested to hear her version of this. But we started having conversations about race. And that was really good. She listened to me and then responded, and I had the chance to listen to her version of things, and I started to understand how two people viewing the same situation could interpret it in two completely different ways, and both views being legitimate, even if they're conflicting. Mm-hmm. And so we cooked up this idea of forming a group that would be for the purpose of talking about race and education in Durham. And I really wanted Dot to do this with me because I liked her and I trusted her, and I knew we could work together. And she lived in Durham,
Mm-hmm.
but she she kind of backed away from taking the lead on that, but she said, you need to go talk with George Wilson, who's on the faculty over at Central, and he was the chair of the Department of Criminal Justice. And so I called up George and said, Dot Brown told me I need to talk with you. Let me tell you what our idea is. And I went over and sat in his office, and George says, this sounds like something worth doing. So we started this process where we invited people to take place in a small group discussion where we had equal numbers of blacks and whites. And the whole point of this was not to make it something that was organized by blacks or by whites, but by this, both of us. And I remember, so I haven't thought about this in a long time. We had a meeting where we just invited people to come, and George's wife, Zenobia, who at that time was the head of the YMCA at UNC campus.
Oh.
She said to me, in this public setting, she said, what's your agenda? What's your hidden agenda here? And I thought, golly, I don't have a hidden agenda. How am I going to persuade this person who's not quite attacking me that I really am trying to struggle with something here that's without knowing how to get from A to B. And I mention this because we became really good friends. Zenobia is a great person. We were just at her house a few weeks ago, and George and Zenobia are really fine folks. So we kind of developed this structure of people committing to meet for 3 meetings, and in each one, there would be some topic that we discussed. And the first one was talk about your own education. And that was incredibly revealing, because all of the black people grew up in segregated schools, in intentionally segregated schools. The white people either grew up in intentionally segregated or de facto segregated, as me as a suburban kid in Detroit. And what that meant, what it meant when integration came along, how that so badly hurt the black community by having their schools subsumed into a white system and all the black pride and tradition being brushed aside. So, I mean, there was a lot of painful and really revealing discussions. And that extended until there were maybe 50 of us who had gone through this process. And we would have joint meetings after people had kind of gone through the initiation of the small group thing. And we would talk about the merger of the city and county schools and how we could help with that. In the end, I don't think we did anything constructive sort of in the bigger picture. That process went on with or without us. But I think what it did was change those of us who participated in it. And one of the guys who was in my first group, Eddie Davis, was a teacher who then became a member of the school board, and who I, continue to have a very warm relationship with. And it allowed, by the setting where we heard each other, it allowed us to come to a much better understanding of how different our perspectives are and what each other's, and not that there's only a white perspective and a black perspective. I mean, there's vast diversity within both of those groups, but it's hard to have that conversation across the black-white boundary. So and Dot kind of kept in touch with that over time. She was a participant in it. She would come to the meetings, and so it went from being an experience, that was prompted by my own sense of feeling that kind of misunderstood white progressive person, to having a little more humility about what I could do by myself as a white person, and how this had to come out of more of a sense of a partnership with the people who are part of my larger community. So it was, I owe Dot a lot for that.
an interesting model for our time, actually. Currently,
You know,
we could use
that's
some.
true, because it's so easy not to talk to people who we know have different political views, and there's a level of intolerance that's probably even in some ways more intense than we would have admitted with our racial divides. Yeah. If only we could.
Well, that's one issue with the progressive movement and the concept of resistance, and we're going to take back the power and so on. The emphasis on power. One problem is, like for decades the Republicans said, government's too big. There should be smaller government, and supposedly well, the more power in government, there's only one government, the more people then contest to get that influence, get that control. And so it actually aggravates some of the tensions between people.
Between people,
And when one sees life as primarily a contest between your side, our side, and the other side, then...
It's not a good dynamic for having a conversation.
Well, it's not a good dynamic for a conversation. It's like, I never studied anatomy, but you have your arm with extensors and flexors. And what enables you to have good control of your arm is the fact that you have these opposing muscles. But when they both lock in,
are clenched.
you get and that's kind of what's happened in our political system, is that even it's important that we have both sides competing, but unfortunately the way they've gotten into
they get rigid.
They've got rigid, and then things don't move smoothly. But so did the educational situation improve for your youngsters?
Well, the larger question is, it improved for Durham kids?
Did it?
I think it has. My own kids ended up going to the specialty high schools in North Carolina to finish their high school. Our son went to Winston-Salem for the School of the Arts, and our daughter went to Science and Math in Durham. And so, they did fine. They were kids, they were kids who were going to do fine, whatever the circumstances. I think the schools are much better overall than they were. I mean, there was a tolerance of ineptitude in this quarantine system that I don't think could exist today. But it's not like we don't have huge challenges. So, that's true with public education everywhere.
Yeah. That copy of Transcendence that I gave you? One of the reasons I'm so excited about TM is the schools programs. So they've got a number of schools in the country now. In fact, they've got schools all around the world, hundreds of schools around the world, where they've made TM available to all the kids and the teachers. And in San Francisco, which is the place that it's most developed, there are 3 public schools, high schools, middle schools, and high schools, where they've done this program that they call the Quiet Time program. It's been going on over 10 years, about 10 years now, since the first one started. In the first year, suspensions and fighting went down by 50%. And over the first few years, they went down even further, to like 70% below what it had been. And scores on tests and grades were going up. Teacher turnover went way down because the whole environment of the school got so much better. At last year's APHA in Denver, the Surgeon General was giving remarks at the closing general session. He did it by video. And he mentioned the program, the Quiet Time program in San Francisco, which he had just visited. And there's this picture on his Facebook page of the Surgeon General, the former Surgeon General now, Vivek Murthy, sitting there with kids practicing TM. Or I don't know if he's practicing TM or just meditating. He I think did his own meditation, but practicing. I mean, while these kids, hundreds of kids in the auditorium are practicing TM. And there's a school in the Bronx, New York. There's a school in Brooklyn, New York. There's the Chicago Crime Lab has now funded the David Lynch Foundation, which is this foundation established by filmmaker David Lynch that is bringing TM to disadvantaged populations in a number of areas.
David Lynch, of all people.
Of all people. Of all people. I've never seen any of his films. I gather they're pretty far out.
Yeah.
But the foundation has a collaboration with the New York Family Justice Center for women who are victims of domestic violence to make TM available to them. They've sponsored TM for homeless people in Los Angeles and in other places, in New York, I think. But anyway, so in Chicago, the Chicago Crime Lab at the University of Chicago gave the David Lynch Foundation a grant in a competitive funding process to bring this quiet time program into Chicago public schools. And they've done that. It was originally a $300,000 grant, then they raised it to $1 million because they were excited about the way it was going. So I think from a public health standpoint, it has terrific potential to make a difference.
I'll have to learn more about this.
So, well, I've given you the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'll show you a video if you want. But anyway, I'm really glad we did this additional, there's this whole area of your community service in Durham, which I'm not really aware of, except every once in a while somebody says, oh yeah, we were over at Alan Wilcox's house, or oh yeah, Alan Wilcox said. And maybe should arrange another interview, or maybe somebody from the Southern Oral History program who knows about interviewing should come and talk to you.
There's better people than me to talk to in this community, but it's, Durham has been the kind of place where as an individual you can actually make a difference. And there are hundreds of examples of that, and so that builds its own sense of possibility and community that we're really grateful to have been a part of.
Okay, well this is great. I'm glad we did this.
Okay, good.
Encore.
Even though you had to take everything apart to do it.
It didn't take long at all.
Put it back together.
It didn't take long at all. Unfortunately, the red light on this that blinks to show that it's recording is on this side of the camera.
Oh, right.
So when I looked over to reassure myself, I couldn't see it. I really hope that because I once